Well, the definition of a dropout varies from city to city, from school district to school district. So a good measure is that the number of Latino youth between the ages of 14 and 25 who are neither in school or have graduated from school is 40%. So we have a 40% dropout rate overall in the Latino community.
Why?
It is extremely complicated. You have persistent poverty, the education of parents, the lack of involvement of parents, which is just mentioned. You have schools that do not really address the needs of Latino students, especially limited English proficient students. The access to programs that enrich the educational experience of students. So there are many factors involved in that. The low resourcing of schools, the lack of teachers, the Latino teachers and teachers who understand Latino students, and overall the lack of the professional development that teachers need to be able to deal with Latino students.
Lindsey, there have been a lot of interventions set into motion to try to bring up that number. A lot of programs that try to reach kids who have dropped out to find some alternative means for them to finish high school. A tremendous number of approaches. It doesn't seem to have changed the outcome very much.
Yeah, that's correct. It really hasn't. And it's not just achievement gaps that haven't changed dramatically over the decades. It's educational achievement more generally. Since the 70s, we have seen dramatic increases in spending. We've seen dramatic decreases in class size, and we haven't seen commensurate gains in academic achievement. We know that graduation rates are still around 70%. They've been that way since the 70s. We know that reading achievement has remained flat since that time. Math achievement has increased a little bit, but not nearly on par with what we would like to see. So, you know, the graduation rates and dropout rates are a significant problem, and not just for Hispanic students. We know that only about 70% of kids in general end up graduating high school on time. And if you look at our large urban districts, it's well below 50% in most of those areas.
When you say on time, graduating high school on time, I think that's an important modifier. There are programs to help kids who have left school long before, who are 18, 19, 20, but they seem to be a drop in the bucket. And if you really finish a high school diploma when you're 20 years old, it doesn't seem to set the table for later acquisition of more education. For most of these young people, this is probably the last credential they'll ever earn.
Yeah, and even so, we know that for those kids that do earn a high school diploma and go on to college, about a third of children in general need remedial coursework when they get to college. So it's this idea of almost a leaky pipeline in K-12 education, that they're not being prepared for future coursework or the workforce for that matter.
Raegen, when you look at the numbers, what do you conclude about why they're so resistant when we put a lot more emphasis on it than we did in earlier decades?
Well, yeah, schools have demonstrated a remarkable capacity for seeming to change, but not really changing. And I think now, though, we're on the cusp of a new era. One of the reasons we can tell is that now, 10 years into the accountability movement, we have data on which schools are doing the job and which ones aren't. We have the Secretary of Education and the President on exactly the same page, being very serious about addressing persistent malperformance of about 5% of schools. And they are going to receive attention under major programs with funds through the stimulus bill, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. So those schools, and especially the high schools, which often are called dropout factories, are part of the problem. You know, the dropouts are easy to pick. There tend to be students who are not on track for graduation in 9th grade. So there's plenty of room for programs to help 19, 20-year-olds, especially newcomers, people that move to the U.S. and have need to acquire English in high school. They often can't do it as rapidly as needed to graduate on time with their cohort. But the problems need to be traced back into schools, and we're addressing those.
So I've long been told that the older you are when you start in a U.S. school, the more likely it is that you're not going to complete. Is that still the case?
I don't know that figure, and I'm sure it breaks down a little bit differently depending on your origin, depending on your, what probably matters more than anything, Ray, is whether you're literate in your first language when you start school in the U.S.
Not prepared to start high school and already on track, behind track.
Right.
How come so many kids, I know you've been working on this as well, but what are some of the reasons why so many kids start high school already behind?
Well, they start high school already behind because they've been progressively losing ground from the elementary schools. So by the time they get into the 9th grade, 8th or 9th grade, they're already, many of them are way behind because they've lost since the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. It's important to catch them at that point, but we also feel that you can't just give away a whole generation of students that are already in high school that can have opportunities to finish, that can have the motivation, that can have the academic preparation to finish. Of the students that go through our programs at Aspida, 95% finish high school, and 90% go on to college. That's not typical, and not all students have access to the types of programs that we offer, which are not school-based programs, but after school and enrichment and motivational types of programs.
A couple of national educational studies said that minority kids were already 3 years behind by the 3rd grade. And I wasn't sure how you could be 3 years behind by the 3rd grade. Like, what have you been doing in school since you started if the general population is 3 years ahead of you and you've only been in school for 4 years? What's going on there? How do you explain that?
Well, I think you're right. There are great schools like Aspira that are doing wonderful things to raise academic achievement, but there are also good state models. If we really care about results, we would look to states that are actually increasing academic achievement, and we have a great example in Florida. Florida is a state that has done more than any other state in the country to raise academic achievement and to start narrowing that achievement gap. We know that Hispanic students in Florida read about 2 years ahead of their peers across the country, which is really impressive. And on top of that, Hispanic students in Florida, as the map details, now outpace or tie the statewide average of all students in 31 states. It's really amazing, and those are on reading scores. And Florida did that through some very common sense reforms. They ended social promotion in 3rd grade. So if a child can't read in 3rd grade, that child does not progress on to 4th grade. They have alternative teacher certification, which has allowed many more bilingual teachers to come into Florida schools than might otherwise have been able to. They started grading their schools, which again sounds like such a common sense reform, but before Florida had this 1 through 5 grading scale. So a parent didn't really know, was it better to have my child in a 1 school or a 5 school? It wasn't very transparent for parents, so they shifted to an A through F grading scale. So a parent intuitively knew it was better to have their child in an A school than an F school. So it was that transparency, grading both schools and school districts. And then on top of that, transparency is useful, but it's only so useful if you have a right of exit out of failing public schools. So parents then had the option to leave failing public schools that for 2 years in a row were deemed an F school in Florida. And ultimately, that school choice provision was knocked down in the Florida Supreme Court in 2006. But Florida still retains vouchers for special needs kids, which has also been very, very helpful for them. So this whole suite of really sweeping education reforms, we believe, have led to these great gains in academic achievement.